The day after the Endeavour rescue, Amy woke up to find her life had completely changed. Her communicator was full of messages. News outlets wanted interviews. The Galactic Council wanted reports. Other stations wanted to know how she had managed to turn the notoriously difficult Kravix cubs into a functional group. But the most surprising message came from Admiral Kelshax. Lieutenant Foster, report to my office at 0900 hours. Commander Zixana will also be present. Amy dressed carefully in her best uniform. This was it. They were probably going to officially reprimand her for overstepping her authority, even if they couldn't deny that it had worked. She looked at herself in the mirror. Same brown hair, same green eyes, same average everything. Except she didn't feel average anymore. When she arrived at the Admiral's office, she found not just Kelshax and Zixana, but also Station Director Vixthor and 3 other senior officers she didn't recognize. This was more serious than she had thought. Lieutenant Foster, Admiral Kelshax began formally. Please sit down. Amy sat, her back straight, ready to accept whatever consequences came. The events of yesterday have been reviewed by multiple authorities, the Admiral continued. Your actions were highly irregular. You violated protocol in several ways. You conducted unauthorized diplomatic contact. You used your position as supervisor to influence military decisions. Amy nodded. Yes, sir. I understand. However, Commander Zixana interjected. You also demonstrated qualities that are rare among officers of any species or rank. You showed moral courage. You found a solution when those with more experience and higher rank had given up. You understood that sometimes rules must bend to serve a greater purpose. Vixthor spoke next, their forearms gesturing expressively. Lieutenant Foster, do you know what happened after word of the rescue spread? I received communications from 11 other stations asking about your methods. 4 different species have requested human supervisors for their youth programs, specifically citing your success with the Kravix cubs as proof of human capability. One of the officers Amy didn't recognize leaned forward. She wore the insignia of the Galactic Council. Lieutenant, I'm Coordinator Ellis from the Council's Education and Integration Department. We've been trying to establish effective multi-species youth programs for 5 years. Most have failed. Children from different species fight, their cultures clash, and supervisors give up. You've done in 6 months what we couldn't do in 5 years. Amy wasn't sure what to say. I just treated them with respect and consistency. That's exactly the point, Coordinator Ellis said. You saw them as individuals who needed guidance, not as problems to be managed. You learned their culture instead of trying to force them to adapt to yours. You led through example rather than through authority. Admiral Kelshax pulled up a document on the desk display. Lieutenant Foster, I am promoting you to full lieutenant effective immediately. I am also assigning you a new position as director of the Multi-Species Youth Integration Program. You will be responsible for coordinating similar efforts across 12 stations in this sector. Amy's mind went blank. Sir, I don't understand. I'm just rank 97. I've never done anything remarkable before this assignment. You were rank 97, the Admiral corrected. And you've done something very remarkable. You changed the paradigm. Everyone else was asking how to control different species. You asked how to learn from them. That perspective is exactly what we need. Commander Zixana stood. The Kravix Empire is formally requesting that you remain as liaison to our forces. We want you to help train our young officers in the methods you've developed. We also want you to continue supervising cubs whose parents are deployed. You've earned our trust, and that is not easily given to outsiders. The meeting continued for another hour, discussing details of Amy's new position, her expanded responsibilities, her increased clearance level. When it finally ended and everyone else had left, Admiral Kelshax asked Amy to stay. You look overwhelmed, the Admiral observed. I am, sir, Amy admitted. 6 months ago I was nobody, average at everything, going nowhere in my career. Now this. You were never nobody, Kelshax said gently. You were someone who hadn't found the right place to show what you could do. The military is good at recognizing traditional excellence, combat skills, tactical thinking, technical expertise, but it's not always good at recognizing other kinds of strength. The Admiral stood and walked to the window overlooking the station. Leadership isn't about being the strongest or the smartest or the most decorated. It's about understanding people, about persistence, about doing what's right even when it's hard. You have those qualities. You always did. You just needed a situation that required them. Amy thought about the past 6 months. The challenges, the tests, the moment she carried Drixon through the station while her body screamed at her to stop. The stand she took against Commander Zixana to save the Endeavor. None of it had felt like leadership at the time. It had just felt like doing what needed to be done. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly. "Don't thank me," Kelshax replied. "Prove that this faith is justified. Go do great things, Lieutenant Foster." When Amy returned to the Kravik's quarters, she found all 17 cubs waiting for her. They stood at attention, a formal military posture that they had clearly been practicing. Kraksik stepped forward, now standing nearly 7 feet tall and showing the beginning of adult musculature. "Commander Foster," he said formally, "we heard about your promotion. We wanted to be the first to congratulate you properly." Then all 17 cubs did something Amy had never seen. They pressed their foreheads against the ground in a gesture of ultimate respect in Kravik's culture. This was reserved for legendary warriors and leaders of great accomplishment. "Stop, please stand up," Amy said, feeling her throat tighten with emotion. "You don't need to do that." "Yes, we do," Zixara said, rising. "You were rank 97 when you came to us. Nobody expected anything from you, including probably yourself. But you taught us something important." "What's that?" Amy asked. "That rank doesn't define worth," Kraksik said. "You showed us that a leader isn't the biggest or the strongest or the one with the most impressive title. A leader is someone who shows up every day and does what needs to be done, someone who protects their pack, someone who makes hard choices when everyone else gives up." Drixon, who had grown from a small cub into a gangly adolescent, added, "You saved my life when I couldn't breathe. You saved those humans on the Endeavor when nobody else would. You teach us every day, even when we make it difficult. That's what a real commander does." Amy felt tears starting in her eyes. She blinked them back. "You cubs have taught me just as much as I've taught you. You've shown me that being different doesn't mean being less. You've shown me courage and honor and loyalty. I came here thinking I was going to supervise you. Instead, you made me a better leader." Over the next weeks, Amy began her transition to the new role. She would still supervise the original 17 cubs, but now she was also training other officers in her methods. She visited other stations, assessed their youth programs, and helped implement changes. She received a message from Patricia Moore, her old academy classmate, who was now a lieutenant commander on a warship. "Amy, I heard about your promotion and new assignment. I can't believe you're in charge of a multi-station program now." "That's incredible. I always knew you had it in you." Amy smiled at the message, but she didn't quite believe it. Patricia had never paid much attention to average Amy Foster before, but that was okay. Amy had learned something important over the past 6 months. She didn't need other people to recognize her worth. She knew it herself now. The cubs threw her a ceremony before she moved to her new quarters in the administrative section. They had prepared speeches and gifts. Zixara presented her with a small carved crystal, a Kravik's honor token that had belonged to the young cub's great-grandmother. "This is too valuable," Amy protested. "I can't accept this." "You must," Zixara insisted. "My mother says you've earned it." This token belonged to a pack leader who united 3 clans during the border wars. She led through wisdom and courage, not through force. "My mother says you remind her of that ancestor." Amy accepted the crystal with shaking hands, understanding the weight of such a gift. In Kravik's culture, family honor tokens were sacred. They were never given to outsiders, never given lightly. That night, Amy stood in her new quarters looking out at the stars. The crystal sat on her desk, catching the light and throwing prismatic patterns across the walls. She thought about her journey. From rank 97 going nowhere, assigned to a posting nobody wanted, to this, director of an important program, respected by multiple species, trusted with responsibilities that went far beyond her experience. Her communicator buzzed. It was a message from Kraksik. "Commander, I have been accepted into the Kravik's Imperial Academy. I will train to be an officer like my father. When I lead my first patrol, I will remember everything you taught us. That protecting others is the highest form of strength. That honor means doing what's right even when it's hard. That real leaders lift others up instead of pushing them down. Thank you for showing a group of difficult cubs what real leadership looks like." Amy read the message 3 times, feeling pride swell in her chest. These window and looked down at the planet below. It was beautiful in a harsh way, with red deserts, and the landing pad was hot and dry. Daniel felt the heat radiating up from the dark stone surface as he stepped off the transport. The air tasted different here, thinner somehow, with a metallic quality that reminded him of blood. He adjusted the strap of his carry bag and followed Amy down the ramp. A delegation of 3 Vareth waited for them at the edge of the landing pad. Even though Daniel had seen images and videos, nothing prepared him for the reality of standing near these creatures. The smallest of them was still a foot taller than him, and their presence radiated power and danger. The one in front stepped forward. Her scales were darker than the others, almost black, and her amber eyes studied Daniel with an intensity that made him want to look away. He forced himself to maintain eye contact, remembering that showing fear would be seen as weakness. "Human Daniel Brooks," she said. Her voice was a deep rumble, and the translator device on her chest rendered it into perfect English a second later. "I am head caretaker Zrix. Welcome to Vareth Prime. We are grateful you have come to assist us." Daniel bowed his head slightly, the gesture of respect Amy had taught him during the journey. "Thank you for inviting me, head caretaker. I hope I can be helpful." Zrix made a sound that might have been approval. "We shall see. Come." The cubs are waiting, though they do not know it yet. They were driven through the Varath capital in a vehicle that moved smoothly over the rough terrain. Daniel watched through the window as they passed buildings that looked more like fortresses than homes. Everything about Vareth architecture emphasized strength and permanence. There were no soft edges, no decorative elements that served no purpose. The education facility was located on the outskirts of the city, a massive complex of connected structures. As they approached, Daniel could hear sounds coming from inside. Roars, shrieks, and the crash of things breaking. Amy glanced at him with raised eyebrows but said nothing. Zrix led them through corridors that bore deep claw marks on the walls and floors. Some of the marks were fresh, Daniel noticed. They passed several rooms where older cubs were engaged in various activities. In one room, they practiced combat moves under the watchful eye of an instructor. In another, they worked on what looked like tactical planning exercises. "We train our young in all aspects of warfare and survival," Zrix explained as they walked. "By age 10 cycles, a Vareth cub should be able to hunt, fight, and live independently if necessary. But first, they must learn to control themselves. This is where we struggle." They reached a large circular door at the end of a hallway. The sounds from beyond it were louder now, and Daniel could feel vibrations through the floor. Something heavy had just hit the ground hard. "This is Den 7, Zrix said. 15 cubs, ages 3 to 4 cycles. They are healthy, strong, and completely unmanageable." She pressed her hand to a panel and the door began to slide open. "Do not show fear. They can sense it and it excites them." The door opened fully, and Daniel got his first real look at the chaos he was supposed to somehow calm. The room was enormous, with padded floors and walls that had clearly been designed to withstand damage. And the cubs were doing their best to damage everything anyway. They were roughly the size of large dogs, but there was nothing domesticated about them. Dark scales covered their bodies, and their eyes glowed with fierce intelligence. 2 cubs were wrestling in the center of the room, rolling over and over in a tangle of limbs and tails. 3 more were climbing the walls, using their claws to grip the padding and pull themselves higher. One had reached nearly to the ceiling, 15 feet up. Another group was playing what looked like a violent game of tag, chasing each other at speeds that seemed impossible for creatures so young. 2 adult Vareth stood at opposite sides of the room, ready to intervene when the play became too dangerous. They looked tired, Daniel noticed. Their scales were scratched, and one had a bandage wrapped around their arm. Then one cub noticed the newcomers in the doorway. Its head snapped around, golden eyes locking onto Daniel with laser focus. The cub went completely still, and that stillness spread through the room like a wave. Within seconds, all 15 cubs had stopped what they were doing and were staring directly at Daniel. The silence was heavy and unnerving. Daniel could hear his own heartbeat loud in his ears. The cub's eyes tracked his every tiny movement, the way a cat watches a mouse. He was acutely aware that he was, in their eyes, prey, a strange creature in their territory, weak and soft and slow. "They are curious," Zrix said quietly from behind him. "This is good. Curiosity is better than aggression." Daniel wasn't sure he agreed, but he didn't say so. Instead, he took a slow breath and stepped forward into the room. Amy stayed by the door with Zrix, understanding instinctively that too many new things at once would be overwhelming. "Hello," Daniel said, keeping his voice steady and calm. "My name is Daniel. I'm going to be spending some time with you." The cubs exchanged glances, communicating in ways Daniel couldn't quite follow. Then, as if someone had given a signal, they charged. Daniel's training had covered many scenarios, but being rushed by 15 predator cubs was not one of them. Every instinct screamed at him to run or defend himself, but he did neither. He stood his ground and kept breathing steadily, just as Amy had coached him during the journey. The cubs hit him like a wave, but they weren't attacking. They were investigating. Small claws, carefully retracted, pawed at his legs and arms. Wet noses sniffed at his clothes, his hair, his hands. They chittered and clicked at each other, their voices high-pitched and surprisingly musical for such fierce creatures. One cub, smaller than the others and covered in lighter scales, pushed its way through the crowd and stared up at Daniel's face. It tilted its head, studying him with obvious intelligence. Then it chirped, a questioning sound. "Yes, I'm very strange, aren't I?" Daniel said softly. He slowly lowered himself to sit cross-legged on the floor, which put him more at their level. The cubs seemed to approve of this, and several of them climbed into his lap or pressed against his sides. They were warm, much warmer than he expected. Their scales were smooth but not cold, and he could feel the rapid beat of their hearts through their skin. Despite their fearsome appearance, they were children. Curious, energetic, overwhelming children, but children nonetheless. From her position by the door, Amy was recording everything on her data pad. Drix stood perfectly still, watching with an intensity that rivaled the cub's earlier stares. Daniel reached slowly for his carry bag, moving carefully so as not to startle anyone. The cubs watched with great interest as he opened it and pulled out a book. It was one of the simpler ones he'd brought, with large illustrations and short sentences. A story about a small animal exploring a forest. "Would you like to hear a story?" Daniel asked the cubs surrounding him. They didn't understand his words, but they responded to his tone. Several of them settled more firmly against him, getting comfortable. Daniel opened the book to the first page and began to read aloud. Once upon a time, in a forest far away, there lived a small brown rabbit. The rabbit's name was Clover, and she loved to explore. His voice filled the quiet room, steady and rhythmic. The cub's ears, small triangular flaps on the sides of their heads, swiveled toward him. They were listening, Daniel realized. Actually listening. He continued reading, turning the pages slowly so the cubs could see the illustrations. Some of them leaned forward to study the pictures, their eyes wide. Others simply closed their eyes and listened to the sound of his voice. The small cub with lighter scales, the one that had first approached him, climbed fully into his lap and curled up like a cat. Its breathing slowed and its body relaxed. Daniel kept reading, hardly daring to believe what was happening. Clover explored the forest all day long. She saw tall trees and colorful flowers. She met a wise old turtle and a friendly squirrel. When the sun began to set, she felt tired from all her adventures. More cubs were settling down now. The restless energy that had filled the room when Daniel entered was fading. 2 cubs leaned heavily against his sides, their eyes half closed. Another had stretched out on the floor near his feet, its tail curled around its body. Daniel turned to the last page of the story. Clover returned to her burrow, tired but happy. She curled up in her soft nest and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, but tonight it was time to rest. The end. He closed the book gently and looked around. 9 of the 15 cubs were asleep or nearly asleep. The others were quiet, grooming themselves or each other with a gentleness Daniel wouldn't have believed possible an hour ago. The 2 adult Vareth caretakers stood with their mouths slightly open, a Vareth expression of shock. Drix walked into the room, moving with the careful silence of a practiced predator. She approached the pile of cubs around Daniel and knelt down beside them. For a long moment she said nothing, just studied the sleeping cubs with an expression Daniel couldn't read. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, and her translator struggled to convey the emotion in her words. "In 20 years of working with cubs, I have never seen this. They do not sleep during light hours. They do not rest unless forced by complete exhaustion. What have you done, human?" Daniel looked down. Daniel returned to Den 7 the next morning with a mix of nervousness and curiosity. He wondered if the previous day had been a fluke, a one-time response to novelty that wouldn't repeat. But when the door opened and the cubs saw him, their reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. They rushed toward him, but this time there was less investigation and more greeting. They recognized him now, the small cub with lighter scales, the one Daniel had mentally started calling Ripley after a brave character from an old Earth movie. reached him first and immediately tried to climb up his leg. "Good morning to you too," Daniel said. Gently detaching small claws from his pants, he made his way to the same spot where he'd sat yesterday and lowered himself to the floor. The cubs gathered around him eagerly, jostling for the best positions. Shrix watched from the observation window above the den, along with 3 other Verath caretakers and Amy. They had set up recording equipment to capture every detail of what happened. Daniel tried not to think about the audience and focused on the cubs instead. He pulled out a different book today, one about a young fox learning to hunt. He'd chosen it deliberately because it dealt with themes the Verath would understand and value, but the ending was gentle, with the fox returning home after a successful day. "Today's story is about a fox named Red," Daniel began. The cubs settled in, and several of them were already adopting the same positions they'd used yesterday. Ripley claimed her spot in his lap. 2 larger cubs pressed against his sides like living bookends. As Daniel read, he noticed details he'd missed yesterday in the excitement. The cubs didn't just listen passively. Their ears moved constantly, tracking every sound he made. When he changed his tone for different characters, their eyes brightened with interest. When he paused at dramatic moments, they leaned forward slightly. They were engaged with the story itself, not just soothed by his voice. That was important, though Daniel wasn't quite sure why yet. By the time he reached the end of the story, 10 cubs were sleeping. The remaining 5 were drowsy and calm, grooming each other with slow, peaceful movements. One of them yawned, showing rows of sharp little teeth, and then curled up against a sleeping sibling. In the observation room, one of the Verath caretakers made a sound that the translator rendered as amazed disbelief. Daniel read 2 more stories that morning. Each time, more cubs fell asleep or entered a state of deep relaxation. By the 3rd story, all 15 cubs were resting peacefully. The change in the room's atmosphere was remarkable. Where yesterday there had been constant noise and movement, now there was only the soft sound of breathing and the occasional sleepy chirp. Amy came down to the den after Daniel carefully extracted himself from the pile of cubs. She moved quietly, mindful of the sleeping children, and gestured for Daniel to follow her out into the hallway. "The data we're collecting is incredible," she said once the door closed behind them. "Their stress hormones drop within minutes of you starting to read. Their brain activity shifts to patterns similar to what we see in resting predators. And Daniel, the effect is lasting longer each time. Yesterday, they woke up about 30 minutes after you stopped reading. Today they're still asleep after 45 minutes. Shrix joined them in the hallway, accompanied by an older Verath male whose scales were marked with elaborate patterns. "This is Elder Kryvax," Shrix introduced. "He oversees all youth education facilities on our world. He has come to see the humans' technique for himself." Kryvax studied Daniel with sharp green eyes. "I have watched the recordings from yesterday and observed today's session. I do not understand what is happening, but I cannot deny the results. You have accomplished what we thought impossible." "It's not really that complicated," Daniel said, feeling awkward under such intense scrutiny. "Human parents have been reading to their children for thousands of years. We've just refined it over time. The stories provide structure, something for young minds to follow. The rhythm and tone of the reading creates a calming pattern, and the routine itself becomes a signal that it's time to rest. But we have stories," Kryvax said. "We tell our cubs of great hunts and honored ancestors. This does not calm them. It excites them." Amy stepped in to explain. "That's because your stories are meant to inspire and energize. They focus on action, achievement, glory. The stories Daniel is reading have different goals. They end with resolution and peace. The heroes return home. The conflicts are resolved. The characters rest. That's the key difference." Kryvax's eyes widened slightly. "You are saying we have been using the wrong kind of stories." "Not wrong for their intended purpose," Daniel clarified. "Your stories are perfect for teaching values and inspiring courage. But they're not designed to help cubs wind down and rest. You need different stories for that, with different structures and different endings." Over the following weeks, Daniel established a routine with Den 7. He arrived each morning and stayed for several hours, reading to the cubs and observing their behavior. The pattern became predictable, and the cubs began to anticipate it. When they heard his footsteps in the hallway, they would gather at the door waiting. The change in the cubs was visible even beyond story time. They were less aggressive during other activities. Their attention spans improved during training sessions. The adult caretakers reported that the cubs slept better at night, which had been a persistent problem before. Ripley became particularly attached to Daniel. The small cub would watch for him and claimed her place in his lap as a right, not a privilege. If another cub tried to take that spot, Ripley would defend it with fierce determination, though she had learned to do so without actual violence. "She has bonded with you," Shrix observed one afternoon. "This is unusual. Vareth cubs bond with their parent group but rarely with individuals outside that group, and never with other species." Daniel stroked Ripley's head gently as she dozed in his lap. Her scales were smooth under his fingers, and she made a pleased rumbling sound. "Maybe she knows I'm trying to help. Or maybe she just likes the stories. Perhaps both," Shrix said. She had been studying Daniel's technique intensely, taking notes on everything from his breathing patterns to the way he held the books. "I would like to attempt reading to the cubs myself, with your guidance." This was the moment Daniel had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. The whole point of his assignment was to teach the Varath this technique, but he wasn't sure it would work when they tried it. Their voices were so different, their entire presence was different. "Of course," Daniel said. "Let's try it tomorrow morning. You can start with one of the stories they already know and like." The next day, Daniel and Shrix entered Den 7 together. The cubs greeted Daniel enthusiastically as usual, but they were cautious around Shrix. She was an authority figure, someone who enforced rules and discipline. They respected her but didn't approach her with the same easy affection they showed Daniel. Daniel settled into his usual spot and let the cubs gather around him. Then he nodded to Shrix. "We're ready when you are." Shrix sat down near Daniel, positioning herself to see both him and the cubs. She held one of the books Daniel had been using, a story about a young bird learning to fly. Her hands, so much larger than Daniel's, made the book look tiny. She opened to the first page and began to read. Her voice was naturally deep and growling, and even with the translator providing English words, the original Vareth speech was audible underneath. It was nothing like Daniel's voice, nothing like human speech at all. The cubs listened politely for about 30 seconds. Then their attention began to wander. One got up and moved away. Another started fidgeting. Ripley remained in Daniel's lap but turned her attention away from Shrix. Shrix stopped reading, frustration clear in her body language. "It does not work. They do not respond to me the way they respond to you." "Keep going," Daniel encouraged. "Don't give up yet. Try lowering your voice a bit more and slow down the pace. Think about the rhythm." Shrix tried again, adjusting her delivery based on Daniel's suggestions. It was better, but the cubs still weren't settling the way they did for Daniel. Several were now engaged in quiet play, ignoring the reading entirely. Amy, watching from the observation window, spoke through the communication system. "Shrix, try removing the translator device. Let them hear only your natural voice without the overlay of the translation." Shrix looked surprised but reached up and deactivated her translator. When she resumed reading, only her natural Vareth voice filled the room, speaking words the cubs could understand in their own language. The effect was subtle but noticeable. A few cubs turned their attention back to her. Their ears moved, tracking the sound she made, but they still weren't getting the full calming effect that Daniel's reading produced. Daniel watched carefully, trying to understand what was different. Then it hit him. "Shrix, you're reading like you're teaching, like you're instructing them. Try reading like you're sharing something precious, something meant just for them. Softer, more personal." Shrix looked at him for a long moment, processing this. Then she took a breath and started the story over from the beginning. This time her voice had a different quality. Gentler, warmer, more intimate. She read as if she were telling a secret to friends. Two cubs moved closer to her. Then another. They weren't climbing on her the way they did with Daniel, but they were listening with the amphitheater was packed with Vareth from all across their homeworld. Daniel stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of faces, and tried not to let his nervousness show. Behind him, a large screen displayed data and recordings from his work with Den 7. Amy stood beside him, ready to help with the technical aspects of the presentation. Elder Kryvax stepped forward to introduce him. "We gather today to hear from human Daniel Brooks, who has brought us a gift we did not know we needed. In 3 months, he has accomplished what generations of our finest educators could not. He has shown us how to bring peace to our cubs, and in doing so, has opened our eyes to new possibilities." The audience made sounds of approval, a rumbling chorus that vibrated through Daniel's chest. He took a breath and began, "Thank you, Elder Krivax. I want to start by saying that what I've shared with you isn't complicated or magical. It's a simple technique that humans have used for thousands of years, something so common in our culture that we barely think about it. But sometimes the most valuable things are the ones hiding in plain sight." He activated the screen behind him, showing footage of Den 7 from his first day. The chaos was apparent, and several Vareth in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Many of them worked with cubs and recognized the daily struggle. "This is what Den 7 looked like when I first arrived. 15 cubs full of energy and aggression, unable to focus or rest. The caretakers were exhausted, and the cubs were not learning what they needed to learn. Everyone was frustrated." The screen changed to show footage from a week later. Daniel sat in the center of a calm group of cubs reading from a book. Most of the cubs were sleeping or deeply relaxed. This is the same den, the same cubs 1 week into our program. The difference isn't magic. It's not some special human ability. It's the result of understanding what young minds need and providing it consistently. A Vareth in the front row stood up. She was young, with bright green eyes and scales that shimmered slightly. "But we have tried everything with our cubs. Discipline, exercise, reward systems. What makes your method different?" "Your method's focused on controlling behavior through external means," Daniel explained. "My method focuses on creating internal calm. The cubs aren't forced to rest. They choose to rest because story time creates a space where resting feels safe and natural." He walked to the edge of the stage, addressing the audience more directly. "Let me explain the key components of what we call bedtime stories. First, there's consistency. Story time happens at the same time in the same way, every day. Cubs learn to anticipate it, and their bodies begin to prepare for rest before it even starts." Amy brought up a chart showing the cubs' physiological responses over time. As you can see from this data, after just 1 week, the cubs' heart rates began dropping as soon as Daniel entered the room, even before he started reading. "Their bodies learned the pattern," Daniel continued. "Second, there's the content of the stories themselves. We don't tell exciting tales of combat or conquest during bedtime. We tell stories that end with resolution and peace. The hero completes their journey and returns home. The problem is solved and everyone can rest. That narrative structure signals to young minds that it's okay to let go of alertness." An older Vareth male in elaborately decorated armor stood. "But will this not make our cubs weak? Will it not reduce their warrior instincts?" "No," Daniel said firmly. "Rest doesn't make anyone weak. It makes them stronger. A warrior who knows how to rest and recover is more effective than one who is constantly exhausted and overstimulated. Your cubs will still train, still develop their combat skills, but they'll do it better because they'll be calmer and more focused." Shriek stood from her seat in the front row. "I can confirm this from direct observation. Since implementing storytime in Den 7, the cubs have improved in all their training exercises. Their attention spans are longer. They retain lessons better. They are becoming better warriors precisely because they have learned to rest." The audience rumbled with interest. Several Vareth leaned forward in their seats, clearly eager to hear more. "The third component is the delivery," Daniel said. "How you read matters as much as what you read. Your voice should be calm, rhythmic, soothing, not commanding or instructive. You're not teaching during story time. You're creating a peaceful environment." He gestured to Amy, who played a recording of Zhrik's reading to the cubs. Her voice had transformed from the harsh, authoritative tone she normally used into something softer and more nurturing. Head caretaker Zhrix had to learn to find this voice within herself. It wasn't natural for her at first, but she practiced, and now the cubs respond to her almost as well as they respond to me. A female Varath with silver streaks in her scales stood. "I work with younger cubs, barely 2 cycles old. Will this technique work with them?" "We believe so," Amy answered. "In fact, younger cubs might respond even better because they haven't yet developed as many fixed behavioral patterns. Starting story time early could make it a foundational part of their daily routine from the beginning." Daniel spent the next hour answering questions and demonstrating techniques. He read several short stories in different styles, showing how tone and pacing affected the emotional response. He explained how to choose appropriate stories and how to adapt traditional Varath tales to work better for calming purposes. "The stories you already tell your cubs about great hunters and famous battles are valuable," Daniel explained. Don't stop telling those. But tell them during the day, during active learning time. Create new versions of those same stories for bedtime. Versions that focus on the hunter's rest after the hunt, the warrior's peace after the battle. A group of caretakers approached after the main presentation ended. They were eager to begin training, to learn the technique themselves. Daniel and Amy spent the rest of the day working with small groups, giving individual guidance and feedback. One caretaker, a male named Theron with dark blue scales, struggled with the concept. I do not understand how to be soft. My purpose is to make cubs strong. Strength and softness aren't opposites, Daniel said. The strongest warriors I've met have also been the most capable of gentleness when it's needed. You can be both fierce and nurturing. Your cubs need to see both sides of you. Theron practiced reading a story, and his voice was stiff and uncomfortable at first, but Daniel coached him patiently, and gradually something shifted. Theron found a way to express care through his voice while still maintaining his dignity and authority. Better, Daniel said. The cubs will respond to that. Remember, you're not becoming someone else. You're just revealing a different aspect of who you already are. Over the following weeks, Daniel and Amy traveled to different education facilities across Vareth Prime. Each location had its own challenges and unique situations. Some dens had cubs with specific behavioral issues. Others had caretakers who were resistant to change. At one facility in the Northern Territories, Daniel encountered a group of caretakers who were skeptical of the entire program. Their leader, a scarred female named Vexra, challenged him directly. We have raised warriors for 1,000 generations without human interference. Why should we change now? Daniel could have been offended, but he understood her concern. You shouldn't change because humans say so. You should consider changing because your current methods aren't working as well as they could. Your cubs are stressed, your caretakers are exhausted, and everyone is frustrated. I'm not offering human culture as superior. I'm offering a specific tool that might help with a specific problem. Vexra studied him with hard eyes. Show me. If your technique works with my cubs, I will consider it. Her den was one of the most challenging Daniel had encountered. The cubs were older, around 6 cycles, and had developed strong patterns of aggressive behavior. They were larger, too, nearly the size of adult humans and far more dangerous. When Daniel entered their den, they didn't show the curious interest that younger cubs had. They showed hostility, seeing him as weak prey in their territory. One of the largest cubs, a male with scarred scales, growled at him aggressively. Daniel stood his ground but didn't challenge. He moved slowly to his sitting spot and arranged his books calmly. The cubs circled him, testing, waiting to see what he would do. I have a story for you, Daniel said calmly. It's about a young warrior who had to learn the difference between strength and violence. He began to read, and the cubs continued to circle at first. But the story he'd chosen was deliberately selected for older cubs. It featured real challenges, genuine danger, and a protagonist who had to think as well as fight. The narrative drew them in despite their resistance. By the end of the story, several cubs had sat down to listen properly. The large male who'd growled at Daniel was sitting just a few feet away. His aggressive posture relaxed. He wasn't sleeping, but he was calm and attentive. Daniel read 2 more stories, both chosen for their themes of wisdom and strategic thinking. More cubs settled down. Some even dozed off. It wasn't the complete success he'd had with younger cubs, but it was significant progress. Vexra watched from the observation window, her expression unreadable. After Daniel left the den, she approached him in the hallway. I see the effect, she said slowly. I do not fully understand yet. 6 months had passed since Daniel first arrived on Vareth Prime, and the transformation was visible everywhere. Storytime had become woven into the fabric of Vareth society, not as a foreign addition, but as something that felt like it had always belonged there. Daniel walked through the main education facility, noting the changes that had occurred gradually. The claw marks on the walls were fewer. The sounds coming from the dens were different, less chaotic. There was still plenty of energy and activity, but it was channeled better, balanced with periods of calm. In Den 7, Drick sat with the cubs Daniel had first met. Though they were older now and preparing to transition to the next level of education, she read to them from a new book, one written specifically for Vareth cubs by Vareth authors. Her voice had the gentle quality she'd worked so hard to develop, and the cubs listened with peaceful attention. Ripley was there, of course. She had grown significantly in 6 months and was now the size of a medium dog, but she still claimed her special spot near whoever was reading. When she saw Daniel at the observation window, her ears perked up and she chirped a greeting that made several other cubs turn to look. After the story ended and the cubs dispersed for their next activity, Shrix joined Daniel in the observation room. There was a warmth in her expression that hadn't been there when they first met. She had softened, not in strength but in approach, and it showed in everything she did. "The council meets with you today," Shrix said. "They have important matters to discuss." Daniel nodded. He'd been expecting this. His original 6-month assignment was ending, and decisions needed to be made about what came next. Part of him wanted to stay to continue the work here, but another part knew it was time to move forward, to share this program with other species who needed it. The council chamber was an impressive space with high ceilings and walls decorated with historical carvings. Elder Kryvax presided over a group of 12 council members, all veterans of various fields from military service to education to diplomacy. Daniel and Amy stood before them, and Kryvax spoke first. "Human Daniel Brooks, we have gathered to discuss the impact of your work and to make several proposals. In 6 months, you have fundamentally changed how we approach the raising of our young. The data speaks for itself. A holographic display activated showing statistics and graphs. Behavioral incidents in youth facilities had dropped by 70%. Training efficiency had increased by 40%. Caretaker satisfaction scores had tripled. Most remarkably, long-term sleep patterns in cubs had normalized across the entire planet. These numbers represent more than improvements in management," another council member said. "A female with elaborately patterned scales. They represent healthier cubs, less stressed caretakers, and a society that is learning to value rest as much as action. We wish to offer you permanent residency on Vareth Prime," Kryvax continued. "We would like you to oversee the continued development of this program and train new generations of caretakers. We would grant you status equivalent to a master educator, with all the honors and privileges that entails." Daniel felt Amy glance at him, curious about his response. It was a generous offer, far more than he'd expected, but he'd been thinking about this decision for weeks. "I'm deeply honored," Daniel said carefully, "but I believe my role here is complete. You don't need me anymore. Shrix and the other caretakers I've trained are fully capable of carrying this program forward. In fact, they've already improved on my original methods in ways specific to Vareth culture. This is your program now, not mine." Kryvax tilted his head, a gesture of understanding. "You are wise. A true teacher knows when their students have surpassed the need for instruction. But there is another matter. Other species have contacted us asking about your techniques. The Krill, the Morvath, even the Zenith Collective. They all face challenges with their young, different from ours but similar in nature. They wish to learn from what happened here," another council member added, "and they have specifically requested human assistance. You have created something, Daniel Brooks, that extends far beyond our world." Amy stepped forward. "The diplomatic service on Earth has also been in contact with us. They want to establish a formal program, sending human specialists to various worlds to share knowledge about childhood development, educational techniques, and cultural practices. They're calling it the Youth Ambassador Initiative." Daniel absorbed this information. What had started as a simple assignment reading bedtime stories to alien cubs had grown into something much larger. He thought about all the species out there struggling with similar problems, all the children who might benefit from something as simple as a calming routine. "I'll do it," Daniel said. "I'll help establish programs on other worlds. But I want to train specialists from those worlds too, so they can adapt the techniques to their own cultures. This shouldn't be about humans imposing our methods. It should be about sharing tools and letting each species make them their own." The council made sounds of approval. Kryvax stood and approached Daniel, placing a hand on his shoulder in the Vareth gesture of highest respect. "You understand what we learned here? It is not the specific technique that matters most. It is the principle behind it. That all young beings need calm as well as challenge. That rest is not weakness but necessary strength. That the fiercest warriors are those who know when to fight and when to be at peace." Before leaving Vareth Prime, Daniel spent a final week visiting all the facilities he'd worked with. At each one he was greeted like family. Cubs he'd read to in the early days had grown and moved on, but they remembered him. Caretakers he'd trained were now training others, spreading the techniques further. At the northern facility where Vexra had once challenged him, he found a thriving story time program. The cubs who had been so hostile now participated eagerly. Vexra herself had become one of the most skilled story readers in the region, her stern exterior hiding a deep well of nurturing warmth that her cubs responded to instinctively. "I was wrong to doubt," Vexra admitted to Daniel during his visit. "I thought you were trying to weaken our cubs to make them less Vareth. But you showed us how to make them more complete, stronger because they are balanced." On his last evening on Vareth Prime, Daniel returned to Den 7 one final time. The cubs were older now, almost ready to graduate to Youth Academy training. They wouldn't remember him in a few years, he knew. But that was okay. They would remember story time, the feeling of peace it brought, and they would likely carry that with them throughout their lives. Ripley was there, and she had clearly been told this was a farewell visit. She pressed close to Daniel, making soft sounds of distress. He held her gently, stroking her scales. "You're going to do great things," Daniel told her. "You're brave and clever, and you've learned how to be fierce and gentle. Those are the best traits anyone can have." Shriek stood nearby, and Daniel could see emotion in her eyes despite the Varath tendency to hide feelings. "She will miss you. We all will. But you are right to move on. Your work here is done, and there are others who need what you can teach." Daniel read one final story to the cubs of Den 7, choosing one of the new Varath stories that Lixa had written. It was about a great warrior who traveled to distant lands and learned that strength came in many forms. The warrior returned home wiser and more capable, ready to teach others what she had learned. By the end of the story, several cubs were sleeping peacefully. Ripley dozed in Daniel's lap, her breathing slow and even. The other cubs were calm and content, ready for the evening ahead. As Daniel carefully stood and prepared to leave, Ripley woke and looked up at him with those golden eyes. She chirped once softly, and Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion. He'd grown to care for these strange alien cubs more than he'd expected. "Goodbye, little one," he whispered. "Be strong, be kind, and remember to rest when you need it." The next morning, Daniel and Amy boarded the transport that would take them back to Meridian Gate. From there, they would begin preparing for the next phase of the program. The Krill had sent a formal request for assistance, followed by the Morvath and 3 other species. As the ship lifted off and Vareth Prime grew smaller below them, Amy smiled at Daniel. "You know, when we started this, I thought we were just doing a cultural exchange. I never imagined it would turn into a movement." Daniel looked out at the stars beyond the viewport, thinking about all the worlds out there and all the children on them. It's funny how the universe works. Sometimes the smallest things have the biggest impact. A simple bedtime story, something humans have been doing for thousands of years, becomes the key to helping other species solve problems they've struggled with for generations. "What do you think the secret really is?" Amy asked. "Why does it work across species so effectively?" Daniel considered this. "I think it's because the need for rest, for calm, for feeling safe enough to let down your guard, those are universal needs. Every intelligent species has young who need to learn and grow, and learning requires both activity and rest. We humans just happen to develop a really effective tool for encouraging that rest, and we're lucky enough to be able to share it." "The gift of the bedtime story," Amy said with a smile. "Humanity's unexpected contribution to galactic civilization.